Welcome back, scholars, to our Digital Academy. I am Professor Spark. Whether we are turning the pages of a timeless novel, our mission remains the same. Will today's sweep us into the concert hall? Let's find out together.
All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're stepping back in time to deconstruct an absolute titan of Western classical music. We're talking about a composition of such staggering scale, such profound emotional depth, and frankly, such brilliant architecture that it has completely transcended its own era. I'm talking about Johann Sebastian Bach's Matthäus Passion, BVV 244, or as we usually call it in English, the St. Matthew Passion. So get ready, because we are going to unpack exactly how a Baroque masterpiece from 1727 was engineered to capture the human experience so incredibly perfectly. But before we get into the weeds, we really have to ask a fundamental question. What exactly makes a nearly 300-year-old piece of music a masterpiece? Think about it for a second. Why does a nearly 3-hour German sacred oratorio, a piece literally written for an 18th century church service, continue to move modern listeners to tears today, regardless of their background, regardless of their beliefs? How did Bach actually manage to reach across 3 centuries and grip us right in the heart? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, a monumental masterpiece. Second, the musical architecture. Third, drama in the chords. Fourth, the spiritual mirror. And finally, a lasting legacy. So starting off with Section 1, a monumental masterpiece, the Scale of Leipzig, 1727. To really grasp the weight of this piece, I want you to picture the historic St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, right around the year 1727. Bach was the music director there, and his ambition for this project was totally unprecedented. He demanded solo voices, a double choir, a double orchestra, and ideally an entirely separate children's choir for certain choruses. Honestly, just the logistical nightmare of squeezing all those musicians into the church balconies must have been absolutely staggering. He'd actually go on to revise the work into the 1730s and 40s, but the sheer volume of musical forces required was massive right from day one. And, Bach actually needed all of those massive forces just to tell this incredibly epic story. The narrative flow, which is drawn directly from chapters 26 and 27 of the Luther Bible, follows the final days of Jesus Christ. It solemnly guides the listener, chronologically, through the Last Supper, the betrayal by Judas, the arrest in the garden, the trial before Pilate, the crucifixion, and finally, the burial. It's a very heavy, intensely dramatic sequence of events. Which inevitably brings us to the runtime. A highly regarded modern performance by the Netherlands Bach Society clocks in at about 2 hours and 44 minutes. Seriously, imagine experiencing that in 1727. Originally, this massive work was split into 2 parts, specifically designed to be performed with a full sermon sandwiched right in the middle during the Good Friday services. It wasn't just a concert, right? It was this all-encompassing, truly immersive event. Moving right along to Section 2, the musical architecture, building the Cathedral of Sound. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Bach organized nearly 3 hours of complex narrative and theology without totally losing his audience. He engineered it like a master architect, basically using 3 distinct narrative devices. First, you have the evangelist. This is sung by a tenor in a speech-like style called recitative, and his job is strictly to drive the biblical narrative forward efficiently. Second, we have the arias, sung by soloists. These act as emotional and theological commentary. They basically pause the action so we can reflect on how we feel about what just happened. And finally, the chorales. These are congregation-style hymns that provide moments of communal reflection, really grounding this epic drama in familiar, everyday melodies. And then Bach takes that structure and just completely electrifies it, using something called antiphonal effects. This is essentially a call-and-response musical technique between 2 groups. Because Bach used that double choir and double orchestra setup we talked about, he could create this vast, incredibly immersive soundscape. Just imagine the overlapping choirs creating an urgent, swirling conversation right in front of you. You hear this brilliantly in the massive opening chorus, Kommt ihr Töchter, helft mir klagen. But within that massive architecture, Bach hides these beautiful, super subtle details. For instance, whenever Jesus speaks, Bach uses this fascinating halo effect. Unlike the evangelist, whose narrative recitative is usually accompanied by just a few simple chords, Jesus' words are constantly illuminated by this lush, glowing accompaniment of string instruments. It instantly signals to the listener that these words are divine and set apart. It's just a genius touch. That brings us to Section 3, drama in the chords. the human element. Now, while this is absolutely a sacred piece, do not mistake it for a passive one. This work is highly theatrical, and Bach weaves visceral, raw human emotion right into the very chords themselves. He achieves this through what are called tourbe choruses. These are vivid, incredibly turbulent crowd scenes. Bach was an absolute master of harmony, and here he uses sharp dissonances and dark minor keys to convey the suffering, the anguish, and the chaotic, shifting emotions of an angry mob. You aren't just watching a crowd from afar, you are standing right in the middle of it. I mean, just look at the words he sets to these dissonant chords. The crowd viciously shouts for the release of the prisoner, Barabbam, and a bit later they scream Kreuzigen, crucify him. It is startling, it's aggressive, it is incredibly operatic for a church setting, completely dropping the listener into the sheer terror and tension of the trial. And you can really feel how this tension builds and shifts across the two halves of the piece. The musical energy distinctly changes. Part 1 is defined by urgency, right? You have the hurried Last Supper, the panicked prayers in Gethsemane, the sudden violence of the arrest. But after that central sermon break we mentioned, Part 2 shifts into a heavy, almost somber inevitability. The pacing drags, intentionally simulating the agonizing march through the trial, the crucifixion, and ultimately the burial. All of that incredible tension and sorrow finally culminates and, frankly, resolves in the breathtaking final chorus where setzen uns mit Tränen nieder, we sit down in tears. It is a moment of profound emotional exhaustion. The drama is over, the crowd has dispersed, and the listener is just left sitting there in the quiet aftermath of a tragedy. On to section 4, the spiritual mirror, empathy and theology. So the crucial point here is that Bach wasn't just putting on a historical reenactment. He was asking his listeners to look deeply at themselves. This piece actually acts as an active spiritual mirror. Through the libretto, which was compiled by a writer known as Picander, and the hymns of Paul Gerhardt, the work invites this intense personal empathy. It actively questions the listener's own role in suffering, like, for example, during the agonizing realization of Peter's denial. It contemplates redemption through sacrifice, and it is deeply infused with layers of Lutheran symbolism. Bach's ultimate goal was worship. He aimed to move the heart toward true devotion. And the primary way he achieves this deep personal connection is through the arias. Take the aria Erbarme dich, which means have mercy. It features a solo alto voice interwoven with a weeping, stunningly beautiful violin obbligato, which is an essential, prominent instrumental solo. It literally pauses the massive, world-shaking events of the trial to focus entirely on a single, deeply personal plea for forgiveness. It grounds the vast drama into an intimate meditation that any single listener can relate to, no matter who they are. Finally, Section 5, a lasting legacy from 1727 to today. So, how exactly did a piece so deeply tied to 18th century Leipzig become a global phenomenon? Well, it actually wasn't an instant hit. In 1727, the reception was mixed, to say the least. A lot of folks in the congregation felt it was way too operatic and theatrical for a solemn church setting. In fact, after Bach died, the piece kind of faded into obscurity. It wasn't until a whole century later, in 1829, that a young composer named Felix Mendelssohn championed a triumphant revival performance of the piece. That single event essentially sparked the massive Romantic-era Bach revival, rescuing this masterpiece from the history books. Fast forward to today, and the St. Matthew Passion is just an undisputed cornerstone of the global choral repertoire. It's performed in concert halls and churches all over the world, especially around the Easter season. And yes, it places exceptionally high demands on both the performers and the audiences. I mean, nearly 3 hours is no small commitment. But it is a piece that vastly rewards repeated listening, constantly revealing ever deeper nuances in its text painting, its counterpoint, and its expressive melody. And this brilliantly illustrates why you really need to hear it for yourself. If you want to dive on and experience these nuances, I highly recommend checking out the Netherlands Bach Society's recording conducted by Jos van Veldhoven. It's actually available right on YouTube. Alternatively, Yvonne Fischer's performances with period instrument ensembles offer incredible historical authenticity. Because of its length, it is absolutely ideal for focused listening, perhaps even following along with a translated score if you can, which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. We live in an age of 15-second videos and constant instant gratification. But greatness, true, soul-stirring greatness, often requires our time and our undivided attention. So I have to ask you, are you ready to sit down, disconnect from the noise of the world, and dedicate 3 hours to uncover the deepest nuances of Bach's greatest cathedral of sound? I promise you the journey is worth every single second.